Hello, and welcome to this webinar on policy governance by the VSBA. We are excited to be able to give an overview here and share some concepts that we've picked up along the way. We're very honored to have two experts in policy governance with us today. I'll call them experts, and I will have them introduce themselves in just a few minutes, but Jackie Wilson is a consultant with TASB that provides board development around policy governance and support. And Julie Mack is a practicing a board chair from a district that practices policy governance. I'll say it that way. And my name is Phil Gore. I'm the director of board services for the Vermont School Boards Association. We're very glad to have each of you join us today. And for those that will be watching this webinar in the future, we encourage you to respond with us, engage with us, let us know how we can be of service to you and what content that you would like to see more of, or perhaps less of. We won't share slides all the way through the webinar. In fact, we'll try to minimize that so that you can actually see and engage with Jackie and Julie. And we'll invite questions from the audience, anyone that has a question. We will try to make that so that everyone can just unmute and ask a question. But if you're one who doesn't really want to interrupt, or for whatever other reason would prefer, we encourage you to enter questions in the Q&A box. That's there's the chat box that I'll try to monitor, but in particular, we'll monitor the question and answer box so that we can capture your questions and then share them. And I see that Elliot Rubin has raised a hand. I'll get to you in just a moment. If you're able to unmute, go ahead and prepare to share your question. So that'll be good. But at the end of the webinar, for those that are participating live and for anyone that registered for the webinar, we'll have some summary information by way of follow-up. We'll share these slides with you and other resources that might be mentioned by Jackie, Julie, or myself. And just as a reminder, these webinars are archived not only on our website, but also on the Vermont School Boards Association YouTube channel. Again, my name is Phil Gore. As Director of Board Services for the Vermont School Boards Association, it's an honor to share this content with you. We know that several boards around the state, school boards, are practicing policy governance, but it's also very much a privilege to have our honored guest. Elliot, are you able to unmute and ask a question? Carrie, do you know if they are able to unmute?
I clicked on ask to unmute, so I think that Elliot is able to unmute at this point.
Okay, and it could have easily clicked on the hand raise function almost accidentally. You'll find a phone number at the top of this slide if you'd like to make a note of it, if you have some questions as we go along, or any kinds of challenges for whatever cause. Please make a note of that phone number, 802-477-3601. Jackie, why don't you introduce yourself to the group and then Julie?
Great. Hi, I'm Jackie Wilson. I'm been an educator in Vermont. I was an educator in Vermont for about 28 years, and I'm nearing on my second year of retirement as a superintendent for the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union. And I think I would disagree with Phil that I'm an expert. I certainly in the world of policy governance, I like to call myself a practitioner. I have worked through the process several times and have come to know it from doing the work. And it I think is something that I found as a leader to be very supportive of my work. But so I'm here to, I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you and excited to have Julie here because Julie and I have worked through that journey together. So, so that's it for me.
Thank you, Jackie. Julie?
Yes, hi, Julie Mack. I'm a school board member, current chair for the Medowee School District. I've been a school board member since, I think, 2018. And Jackie was the first superintendent for our new district. So we did work together. I am definitely not an expert. I would say that our board is transitioning more than practicing, but we are fans and are glad to talk to people about this.
Well, let's start right at the top with Jackie, Julie, whoever wants to jump in, whichever of you wants to jump in. What is policy governance? And how is it different than any other kind of governance?
I don't mind starting off with that. Policy governance really is, it's a form of governance that clearly identifies the role of what is referred to often as a CEO, which is a superintendent, and the school board. And it's very clear roles and responsibilities that those two entities have. And it's not, if you read the Vermont School Boards Association work around effective school boards, there's a lot of similarities. I think the big difference is that the roles are just so clearly defined. The board is focused on governance and they are connected. Their responsibility is to connect with what is called the owners of the organization. And the owners are your community members, your voters, your taxpayers. And the job of the superintendent is to really manage and implement the policies that have been articulated and refined and identified by the board. So you're kind of the superintendent is the means person. This is how we get there. And the board they're the policymakers, the governance folks, and their main policy, that the most important policy that a board develops, is called their ends policy. And the ends policy states, this is what we want our kids to leave our system, who we want them to be, what we want them to be good at as far as competencies are concerned. And really, they often speak to, those attributes that a community values. And to get to those ends policies, it is a responsibility of the board to engage with their community and to continually engage and to keep up to speed. So it takes the board away from management and worrying about, oh, the boiler went, oh, we need a new roof. That's really the job of the superintendent and the people that work in the system. Instead, the board is focusing on the future of the district. They should have a good sense of where their kids are as learners, what are our strengths, what are our challenges. So they're very involved in that, but they're not involved in the means. And we can get into it. There's like four buckets of policies that are primary to policy governance. But I mean, I think the most interesting, this is why I'm really happy Julie is here, because Julie, really got to experience what it was like from the very beginning. So I know that she'll have a good story to tell us.
Jackie, we do have one question, which is really great to have right off the top. And that is, someone wants to know, can you define what you mean by governance?
By governance, I mean that you are, okay, this was my definition, again, that practitioner of policy governance. The governance is really overseeing the well-being. You are trustees, you're overseeing the well-being of the entire district. You know what your owners want for your kids, and you have policies in place that clearly articulate what the superintendent can and cannot do. and you have monitoring systems in place to make sure that that superintendent is accountable. And you also have policies as to how you operate and govern as a board, and you check up on yourselves to make sure that you're accountable. So I know that Phil too he'll probably send you some information with those 4 buckets of policies, but there's probably altogether, oh, I'm just on top of my head now, there's probably anywhere from like 15 to 20 different policies that really clearly articulate how the district should operate. And it's the board's job to make sure those policies are implemented. And that means is the superintendent doing what they need to do. And it's their job to revise them if they need to be revised.
Thank you very much for that, Jackie. You know, governance in general, sort of a dictionary definition, if you will, is it's a system by which an organization is controlled and it operates, and then it's the mechanism, just to underscore what you emphasize there, it's the mechanisms for holding the system accountable. So governance, again, dictionary definition kind of thing, is a system for holding an organization accountable. And we see governance in a lot of different areas. Large corporations today talk about data governance and the way in which an organization handles its data, holds who has access, who holds things accountable. And when we think of school district governance, a lot of it does involve a set of policies that oversee and govern the system. I'd love for Julie to weigh in on this question of, so maybe adding to or emphasizing some things that Jackie shared about policy governance and what it is, but how will policy governance help a school board? What will it do for a school board?
Oh, good. This is sort of one of my favorite things. And FYI, I like analogies and storytelling. So you're gonna get a lot of that. I really like the structure of policy governance. I remember one of my first things that I did as a newly elected board member was to attend an intro to school board training by the VSBA. And one thing that I remember super clearly walking out of there with is that it is not my job to run a school. And if you think about that, it makes all the sense in the world. I have a bachelor's degree in biology, and I'm currently working as a municipal treasurer and a baker.
Wow.
I have no business in school operations. I have no training in education. It's just not what I'm good at. It's not what I've been trained or educated to do. So my role as a school board member has to be helping the system, keeping the connection between the system and the community, keeping that there and strong. So I like to think of policy governance as like, I initially like to think of it as like a box where it's very clearly defined. Everything that's in this box is yours to use. And what I mean by yours is the CEO, so the superintendent. So we give her a list of, this is the job that we want done. And then we say, you can use anything that you want as long as it's not outside of this box. So we clearly define the can'ts. Our priority is whatever, we'll make something up. Like our priority is outdoor education. Okay. Your job is to make that happen, but you can't do X, Y, and Z to make it happen. But everything else is fair game. I think that's sort of inspirational for a superintendent to realize, like, this is okay. I've been told what my goal is, and I'm not being overly restricted in how I go about it. I have a few things I can't do, but other than that, I can create what I think that they want. And then it allows a school board to think consistently about the future. Rather than putting out fires, we're engineering the infrastructure to withstand things.
I like that. So I know in policy governance, one of those structures is the executive limitations. Talk to us about how executive limitations really help produce better results, or how it can help. What's the difference? Do you know, between having executive limitations or maybe just a traditional policy or governance approach?
Julie, want me to start from my perspective as a CEO, and then you,
Sure.
I know you have an opinion on that too. From a CEO's perspective, when I started working with executive limitations as a superintendent, it was really a body of work. Well, let me back up. I guess as a superintendent, I thought I knew exactly how everything ran in my organization. But when I finished with having to work through my executive limitations, I did know. So I'll give you an example. So in executive limitations, your financial operations, there are policies that speak directly to your financial operations and what your responsibilities are for reporting to the board. So you'll have a policy on your financial operations, and then the job of the superintendent is to say, okay, this is how I interpret this policy. This is what I think this policy means, what the board wants from me regarding their financial well-being of the district. And then I went through and I said, okay, this is what all of these things mean. And that's pretty lengthy. So there's no jargon, it's really crystal clear. This is what I interpret this policy to mean. And then here is the evidence that I am going to provide to the board so that they know that I am meeting the demands of this policy. And there's my accountability. So I say, I thought I understood all of the finances and was crystal clear on that, but I learned from working through executive limitations, especially in the area of finance. I had an amazing business manager, trusted her fully. And however, executive limitations forced me to get to know the inner workings of the finances. I had to know, how do you know that this is the case? Where is the evidence that we are in compliance? I had to go through that whole process. I spent a couple of months with my business manager so that I clearly understood that. And then she told me, here's the documentation, Jackie, that I'm going to provide you that demonstrates that we are meeting this policy. Now, never before did I have to do that. So what it does is it takes away the, oh, I hope I have a good business manager. Now it's like, well, if I don't, I'm going to find out. And if something's going south, I'm going to know. And so it takes away that I don't want to say the personal aspect of it or but the trust. It just really clearly spells out what is needed and how you are accountable to the organization. And I just think that really helps with whomever the superintendent is, whoever the business manager is. Here it is, it's spelled out. And this is what we're accountable for.
Julie, how does executive limitations help a school board?
Yeah, so I think Jackie's kind of hitting the nail on the head. It removes some of the ambiguity over who does what, whose responsibility is what. I mean, we're not running schools, but we are making sure that they're run well. And the executive limitations sort of spell out like what the role of the superintendent is, what the role of the board members are, and what the role of the board chair is. And so it just makes things clear. And I think it allows for board members to think differently. I have an example of a time. So this was before we had adopted policy governance. We had a transportation issue come to us as a board. And I would say that an hour of our 2-hour board meeting was taken up just spitballing, just trying to figure this issue out. And as we reflect back on that now, I mean, and we've brought it up so many times when we go through policy governance activities, we keep bringing this example up as a board. I think we would have gotten to the same place, but we would not have been there for an hour doing it. It was like, it finally clicked for us. We can say what we require for transportation, but I don't think it behooves anybody for us as a board member to, as a group, to sit and think, well, how can we do this? And then to impose that on someone who we have no idea what their day-to-day work life is like. I mean, and so we're going to create an answer to this problem and then demand that someone do it our way when we have no concept of whether or not our way will work. I think these executive limitations really allow us to get outside of that and say, is this addressed in policy? If not, do we need to change something? Or is this not really a problem for us? Is this something else?
So it gives you kind of a filter or a lens to assess issues, needs, concerns people might have. Is that accurate?
I think it gives us a filter to really assess whether or not this is a board problem, or if this is is this a policy issue, or is this a procedure issue? Is this something that we need to deal with at all? Or is everything, unfortunately, not everything works for everybody, right? So sometimes someone may come to the board with a problem. And I think it's up to us to say, is this problem something that we need to fix by amending a policy? Or is this one of those situations where, unfortunately, we're not going to come up with a solution for you, and so it isn't really a problem? Or is this something that, like, someone within the system can come up with a solution, not us?
Okay. Thank you. So
And I just want to add one thing that was really helpful to us when we were learning this, because we spent, about a year or more as we played with this before we adopted it. And we would do practice sessions with our consultant. And so she would give us hypothetical scenarios. But many of them were kind of close to things you may have experienced in the past. And then we had to go through, that's how you really learn your policies. We had to go through our policies and say, do we have a policy anywhere that speaks to this? And if so, what does it say? And so given that, how should we respond? So when I say policy governance takes discipline, that's kind of how your mind starts to shift. It's like, do we have something in policy that speaks to this? Let's take a look. Let's dig into that. If not, we may need to adjust the policy, but usually there's something there that gives us direction as to how we should respond.
I love that idea of role playing or case studies for, really integrating learning with how does this play out in our district? That's a great example. Jackie, we had a question in the chat that I can give the quick answer to, but then I'll have a follow-up to you. So someone had asked, are the 15 plus policies that Jackie mentioned, are they part of the VSBA model policy manual? And the answer to that is no. In fact, I'm not aware, out of the 49 school boards associations in the country, plus the National Association, I'm not aware of any school boards association that has sort of a prepared or model policy governance manual. It truly is a different kind of work than the traditional policy manuals that are mostly about compliance with state laws and regulations. So I think one resource, Jackie, you could probably point participants to, where could they view the types of policies that are mentioned? Are these available on a school district website, or some of the resource that might help people see those?
Well, because we're a small state, most of us, as we started our journey on policy governance, got our training from Val Gardner, and some of you may know her, but Val really helped many of us get started with that work. And she's not doing that so much anymore, but boy, she really set a lot of us up. So what Val did was she would really give us a set of policies that I think they came from Carver and from John Carver. And we start with that core set of policies. So if you go and take a look at some of the districts that are using policy governance, you will see a lot of similarities in those policies. But as time goes on, boards make adjustments. So then you'll start to see some variation in the language. So the way we started, and I think it was a good way to start, Val said to us, don't get hung up on the exact wording of all these policies. Accept them, get to work with them. And then if they're not working for you, then you revise them. Because in policy governance, you do a policy review of your policies on an annual basis. So you have what's called a work plan and you revisit those policies. So you have that opportunity to do that. So if you went on, there's, Winooski is a policy governance board, Taconic and Green is, Medowee, where Julie's from. So if you go on and look on the website of those districts, you will see their list of policy governance. The thing that is the same for everybody is that I mentioned before, there's those 4 buckets. There's always an ends policy. There's executive limitations, there's board management delegation, and there's governance process. So you'll always see those 4 categories, but you may see some variation. I can't hear you. Still can't hear you.
I'm muted just in case my dogs bark, sorry. They're known to do that. I'd love for Julie to talk about the governance process policies. So those that are specifically about how the board does its work. Julie, what has been your experience with those, and how have those helped your board?
So as I said at the beginning, I would call us a transitioning board. We did just what Jackie told you guys. We adopted a set of policies and without really worrying too much about them. And now we've sort of started going through them. So we have, and also to be fair, we're kind of operating, well, we are in a side-by-side with Taconic and Green, which is another district in the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union. And we're just sort of a little behind them in their policy governance process. So we have totally stolen a lot of their policies. And as time moves on, we interpret them and then tweak them as needed. So we've started the process of taking their already done interpretations and just editing through them. So I don't have a ton of experience answering to these questions, but I do want to emphasize just that shift in thinking that policy governance has brought us, that really just changes the mindset. What was my really great railroad analogy? We're not the conductor on the train. We're not even shoveling coal into the furnace, right? We are up ahead laying the tracks so that the train goes where our community tells us it wants us to go. So our job really has to be focused on paying attention to what our community values, making sure that the system is set up to provide those values, and making sure that we do that in a fiscally responsible way. So the governance policies really makes it crystal clear where our job lies. And it's not in the day-to-day. It's really about getting into the community, talking to your constituents, finding out what is important to them, and making sure that we set up a structure to allow our system to move into the future healthy and strong and providing for our community what our community wants.
So we had a question in the chat, and we're not sharing slides right now on the screen just to allow screen space so that we can see Julie and Jackie when they're talking. I do want to answer the one question about the 4 types of policies. So Jackie has mentioned the executive limitations policies, and these are what the superintendent or CEO cannot go beyond or cannot exceed. Often they're worded in the traditional John and Miriam Carver policy governance model. They're typically worded as thou shalt not, and it sets a limitation. There are these governance process policies. That's how the board does its work. What will that look like? And then Jackie referred to the board management delegation policies. So that's what they're actually specifically delegating to the superintendent. And then very importantly, we want to get to the ends policies and just a little bit more of this nomenclature, but that the ends policies, they determine the objectives. Jackie, is that the way? And Julie, you would say it, they determine the objective or the desired results.
It's the desired results, yeah. What is your desired result for your learners? What do you want them to be good at? What competencies do you want them to have? What attributes are valued? So that's the work that's the fun work that the board does go through with engaging their communities to get a sense of what does the community value. Competencies in academics are usually pretty similar, but attributes of what a community values, the attributes they want their kids to have, that there's some variation in that. And so those are the conversations you have with your community.
There was a question for Julie in the chat here, and it's simply this: for clarity, you belong to a supervisory union, yet each district in the SU is reviewing and adopting policies independently. Is that accurate?
It is, but I will say that we're very careful. At least I am, when we make decisions and when we go through our reviews, we try not to deviate that far from our side-by-side district, just because we are aware of how difficult that might be for a superintendent to have 2 completely different boards. And we are different boards. I don't want to say that we sort of bend our will to anyone else. We're very independent in our thinking and our operation, but we are just sort of aware of, like, let's not ask a superintendent to do a completely different job for us than they're doing in another district.
Okay. Jackie, in your experience as a superintendent, is there anything you would add to that, just for kind of operationally how that works with school systems?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when we started with policy governance, I mean, I think we should just let everybody know that it was right after, it was post consolidation. So Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union went from 12 boards to 4. So we took the opportunity. So the first board that successfully went through that consolidation was the Taconic and Green. So that was the largest. That was the by far the biggest geographical area, the most schools, 4 of our 5 schools. And so we started that journey with policy governance, and the intent always when we started that work was to eventually, the hope, and it hasn't happened yet, but the hope was to eventually, we even already mapped out that the supervisory union board would have a similar set of policies. And so once the journey was complete with the districts adopting their set of policies, then the supervisory union board would look at it and say, okay, what can we let go? Not all policy governance policies adhere to apply to a supervisory union. It's not, they don't have the same workflow. They don't have, so not everything applies, but the goal is to keep those and keep in as close alignment as you possibly can. So as a superintendent, I always kept that conversation going with my supervisory union board. And of course, they're members of the local districts. So, they were involved in that process and clearly understand it.
Thank you. I would like to just share on the screen some of the nomenclature here that's used in policy governance, because it may be just helpful by way of introduction to show some of these language terms. And then maybe Jackie and Julie, if you want to share your thoughts on this nomenclature that's a bit unique. Ends, means, and executive limitations. Julie, how do ends and means play out in your school board work? How does this help govern the district?
So when we first adopted policy governance, we sort of took already created policies from Taconic and Green. But what we did do, we had a clear understanding and desire, and just across the board desire from all of us to really get into the community's head and figure out what mattered to them. And that's where we did our work on ends. Was we did a community engagement survey, we gathered that data, and then we put that into policy, stating what our priorities were for, what our expected results were for kids leaving our system. And then we worked, and then the rest of the policies kind of are the means, right? So what we will and won't allow a superintendent to do. I mean, obviously there's like, you cannot do things illegal is like the very first layer of that. And then we can carve out more nuance beyond that. But I think it really allowed, it just really allows for us to direct a superintendent to providing us with the results that we're looking for without too much dictation to how they do that.
Nice. Jackie, what would you add to that? I'm going to share that slide again just briefly here. Ends, means, executive limitations. Is there anything for the participants you might add to understanding?
No, I mean, I think that where it really helps, and again, I'll wear my leader hat, where it helped me as a superintendent is that I had great clarity as to what my board wanted for their learners. And, but so say, for example, we had some weaknesses in numeracy and mathematics, and I knew that that's a place we had to attend to. So the board would expect that I would put a plan in place to address that. And I would be I was responsible for making sure that, let me find some research-based programming or the means that would help to provide my students with what they needed to hit those goals. But I didn't have to go to the board and say, would you approve this program in mathematics? Because that's not really their job. It's my job to work with the experts in my districts that know about mathematics to come to a landing on that. So I'm accountable to the board for increased performance for my students. But it's also it really ups the accountability, because not only am I accountable for that, and then I'm also responsible for finding the way to do that.
Nice. Well, we had a question that came in through the Q&A that I think it's really easy to anticipate this particular question. And I have a slide that speaks to it, but I'm not sure that this slide will be exhaustive by any means. And I have just one concern as somebody that's been in this work for a while of board development with policy governance that I might add. But let me see if this will display. So the question was, in some ways, policy governance sounds ideal, which makes me wonder, what are some of the drawbacks or challenges? Julie and Jackie, what do you see as some of the drawbacks or challenges of policy governance?
So I can tell you one of the hesitancy, we took a while to come to this, and one of, and in fact, I would say that we had one particular board member who was really hesitant. And I think that they were concerned about a loss of local control. And I can kind of see where that comes from, because we are really shifting what we expect. We're clearly defining and shifting what we expect a superintendent to do. And I think that this particular board member was just concerned that that meant that we weren't going to know things. We weren't going to be able to stop things that were put in place by a superintendent, even if we were sure that they were wrong. But I think the more time we spent practicing, the more time we spent working with Val and then with Jackie and learning, really learning our policy, like really learning the language of our policies, that sort of comes out in the wash. But I will say, I would not have gone for a change like this if we did not have a good superintendent as we were transitioning. We've been really, really lucky. We started with Jackie, who was super willing to experiment with this. And she was super willing to be patient and kind with us as we worked through our issues. And we transitioned from Jackie to our new superintendent, who's fantastic. And I think if we had really ornery board members and or a less patient and understanding superintendent, I wouldn't recommend doing this in those circumstances.
Yeah, that's an interesting risk. All of this depends on who the players are, who the team members are. And I'm very curious with a follow-up question, did policy governance and your work through policy governance help you select the most qualified candidate to be superintendent? Because, just in your process and structure, were you so immersed and planful that it helped you select who the best superintendent for your district would be?
I'm not remembering how far we were in policy governance when we were doing our superintendent search.
Okay.
But I think the one advantage that I will identify now, looking back, is when you're in it, once you've gotten into it, I do think it provides some insulation from bad apples, right? So someone who gets on a board because they have an axe to grind is going to run into the wall of, is this in policy somewhere? Is this addressed in policy? And you can't just come in and ram through your agenda, because we have those 4 buckets and we have like the board delegation. So you're not going to come in and ram through your idea of what the best literacy program is, because we don't operate schools. That's actually the superintendent's job. And then we have the board management policies where we're like, actually, you can't just bring up a topic that's your, passion project and demand board time be spent on that. It has to go through the chair. It has to be on the agenda. It has to be, the whole body agreeing to this being how we do things.
I've seen more participation, more interaction here in the chat and in the Q&A than any webinar this spring, so that's a good sign. It also means we're not going to be able to cover everything because we've got less than 15 minutes left. But I do want to touch on people's questions as much as possible. And then also, let me just say, one of my concerns with policy governance has always been the sustainability of it. Right, it does have a unique nomenclature. It is another language and a way of doing things that people need to learn to set it up. And so then just the sustainability as board members transition, as superintendents transition, the system did a lot of work to gear up for policy governance. And then any brief thoughts, Julie or Jackie, on how do you sustain it over time with changes in the board composition as well as who your superintendent is?
I mean, go ahead, Julie.
I think we as a board have made a commitment, a financial commitment, to be honest, to onboard new people. And I think we have made an emotional commitment to being willing to do the work. And I don't think it's fair for me to try to speak to the sustainability of it, since we adopted this like a year or two ago.
Okay.
So it's not really a long-term thing for us. But we are working on really developing a work plan. Like a lot of our work in the recent months has been figuring out when we're going to work on this set of policies and when we're going to work on that set of policies, and making sure that we follow along that plan. I think it helps to provide some structure, honestly, like in just chronologically what we do from January to December, and when does it make sense to talk about this set of policies? Does it make more sense to talk about it, at a retreat, or does it make more sense to talk about this after we do budgeting or before we do budgeting? So I think in that way, I think that will help with the sustainability, as really figuring out your time frame, taking the time to figure out that.
My apologies. Bernie is desperately trying to join the webinar, and so he's worked very hard the last several minutes to get up here, and so this is Bernie. Sorry.
Okay, I have a few questions if you want me to ask them now.
Let's let Jackie weigh in on what Julie was just saying. Anything
Okay.
she could add to that first?
Yeah, I'll just add to the sustainability. I used to say to my boards, and I say to boards that I work with currently, when you're in policy governance, you're always on a continuum, and you'll get new folks that come on board, and you'll have to assess, this is where we are, this is our new learning that needs to happen right now. And I don't think that policy governance is different from it's a particular way of governing. But I would argue that any governance system requires you to think about sustainability, and to think about onboarding, and to think about your intentionality behind what are we going to continue to do to make sure that we can do this work and do it effectively. So it's just a particular discipline, but it does, Julie's right, is that you already have some things in place that kind of set you up to continue that. You're not reinventing the wheel every year when new people come on board.
Jackie, I know there's some different questions in the chat and in the Q&A, but one common question or challenge, if you will, is what about with state statutes? And the author of this question is pointing out the statutory requirement. I just coincidentally read this week about school boards must approve individually all professional hires. Mm-hmm. And that's not a quote from statute, but the idea. How does policy governance comply with the law and support good governance?
So you work through that. So in Vermont, you'll have your systems that are policy governance. They'll have their state policy, you'll have their mandatory policies under the state, and you'll have your policy governance policies. So to meet those under your policy governance, sometimes things can be delegated to the superintendent. But for example, that one you just gave on the hiring. So the approach you use in that, anything like that usually goes under the consent agenda part of the agenda on the board meeting. And so there is a clear understanding that the board has delegated, and they have, of the hiring of quality people to the superintendent. They're accountable for that. And the superintendent will, on the agenda, include, here's under the consent agenda, here are the people I'm recommending for hire, and they will get board approval. But the things, there's that understanding that it's your job, superintendent, to do that work. And I'm not going to chew through all of that. I assume you've done your work, and if something goes south, you're responsible for that. But so they approve it, but it's done in a consent agenda. And consent agenda, you know, there may be a number of things. There may be hires there may be some other business thing, and it's just a motion. I move to accept the consent agenda, and the board does that. So it's not like a big, long process. I can't hear you.
You're able to comply with the law.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And very related to this, we had a question earlier from a thoughtful board chair. And Julie had mentioned that most board members are not education experts. So she was wondering how that fit with board determining executive limitations, right? So when there's executive limitations, how does that fit or coexist with the reality that even if somebody's on a school board and comes from a background in education, that's not their role on the board. They're not there to be an educational leader. They're there to be a governance leader. So Julie, how do you mesh that up with executive limitations?
So I actually think that executive limitations helps us in that. It's just, I wish I had policies in front of me that I could give examples to you for, but I sadly I don't. But I mean, so I think it helps. I don't think board members need to understand a system to come up with policies in the bucket of executive limitation. I think that we more need to understand that it's more important that we understand the definition of who does what, right? That's more important that we understand than that we understand the what. It's more important to understand whose responsibility it is and what we're not allowing them to do to get to the end goal. I think that's more important than understanding the nitty-gritty details of the system. And I think executive limitations allows us that, because it very clearly tells you, board, you work as a whole, you communicate through your chair to the superintendent. The superintendent is responsible for hiring people. The superintendent is responsible for making sure that the programming is in line with what you have decided is your budgetary limit and what you have decided are your goals. And I kind of don't see that as not meshing. I think it does mesh.
Nice. Well, I think you covered that well. We've got 5 minutes left in our open webinar here for the recording, but I'm happy to stay. And I don't know if Julie and Jackie, if you could stay 5 or 10 minutes after, and we could have a conversation with folks that have additional questions. There is one though that's come up here that it's a fairly common criticism in the media, in particular, about policy governance being used by school boards. And the author of this question states there's plenty of research, primary problems, that there's too much power concentrated in the administration and getting reliable measures for achievement of objectives. What's the response to the criticism that policy governance abdicates the board's responsibility and gives too much to the administration?
I mean, I think when we started this afternoon, the thing I found out right away was the level of accountability that how much my accountability increased as a result of policy governance. So I disagree with that, with that belief. I think it really, the board made clear as to what I had to do when I was accountable for it. So I don't think the board in any way abdicated their responsibility. Instead, they were clear about what needed to be happen, and it was clear what I needed to do, and I needed to demonstrate that to them. So I just think it became more transparent as to this is what's going on, and this is my job. And could I always comply with policy? Absolutely not. But if I could not, it's there is a policy that says if you cannot comply, you better let your board know, and you better let them know what's going on. So there's policies that speak to that. Communication better be crystal clear. Do not surprise that board in any way.
I like that.
So you have to be true to that. So I just really I've heard that complaint too, and it's been my experience that the accountability just really increased for me.
Julie, would you add anything to that? Do you feel like policy governance holds the superintendent administration accountable as well, better than, different than traditional policy governance?
Sure. Yeah. I'm going to answer that through an example. I was able to pull up one of our policies, treatment of staff. With respect to the treatment of paid and volunteer staff, the superintendent shall not operate without written personnel rules that clarify rules for staff, provide an effective handling of grievances, protect against wrongful conditions. And then 2, discriminate against any staff member for non-disruptive expressions of dissent. And 3, allow staff to be unprepared for emergency situations. So that's our policy as written. And our job as board members is we get an interpretation from our superintendent who says, like Jackie said at the beginning, there's no mumbo jumbo. There's no nomenclature that's very exclusionary to people that aren't in the know. They spell it out. I interpret this policy to mean, and they tell us what they think that policy means. Then they say, the evidence that I will provide you is this. So we have to approve that interpretation of the policy. So if during that process, we don't feel that the superintendent is really understanding what we mean by that policy, we can add in language that sort of shrinks up the space around what they can and cannot do. And then another step then is the actual monitoring. So it's when we are presented with the data. So we are telling through policy what we want. We are hearing through interpretations that they get it. They understand what we mean. And then we are seeing compliance through monitoring. And they are telling us, this is the evidence I said I would give you. Here is the evidence that I am doing this the right way. So we have multiple steps that allow us to make sure that they are following the policy, they are understanding what we mean by it, and they are proving that they are doing it.
No, thank you for that. But there was a question in the chat earlier. Are there policy governance coaches available? And yes, there are. I'm aware of a few people that have been doing training in policy governance in the state of Vermont. Jackie is an individual who's steeped in this, very knowledgeable. She's done a lot of consulting with the Vermont School Boards Association and may be available, depending upon her schedule and other commitments, to provide policy governance support. I tried to add the word support and coaching and make it one word. Support and coaching for school boards. So I would encourage you to reach out to us at the Vermont School Boards Association if you have more questions or comments, concerns, you want to investigate further. There are people that are available to provide this support and meet the needs. I know it's 1 o'clock already, so I definitely want to thank Julie and Jackie for the gift of their time and for the gift of everyone's time that's participated in the webinar. There are 2 or 3 other questions in the chat. I'll have to be able to scroll back up through here and be able to get to those. But Carrie, I think we can stop the recording and just say thank you very much for participating in this webinar.